It is November 2024 now, and I'm doing a review for this book. It is The Private Lives of the Tudors by Tracy Borman. So this is another book about the Tudors. If you remember last month, I'd just read a biography about Catherine Howard, who was the wife of Henry VIII, and I absolutely loved that book. I've been reading this other book about the Tudors, and I'm really enjoying being immersed in that whole Tudor world. It's just really exciting. So, this book it's really well written. Borman, she gives you loads of sort of personal information about them and their way of life, their clothes, food, the structures of court and things like that, and also about their personal characters. And I found her writing to be just really immersive and wonderful. I've enjoyed it so much. I'm going to just run through briefly who the Tudors are. So the book I read before was about Catherine Howard, who was a wife of Henry VIII. And this book, it covers all the Tudor dynasty, from Henry Tudor, Henry VII, up to Elizabeth I, who is the last Tudor monarch. So, Henry VII was the first Tudor. He was Henry Tudor, and he beat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth, and that brought to an end the War of the Roses, which was a continuous sort of feud between two royal families coming down, who both thought that they should be the ones in charge. And Henry Tudor probably didn't have the strongest claim to the British throne, but he did win. And to strengthen his claim, he married Elizabeth of York. And Elizabeth of York was a princess of one of the opposing sides, who had been king. So by marrying her, this sort of legitimised Henry's claim to the throne even more, because obviously his children would be from her bloodline, which probably had the stronger claim. So according to what Borman was saying, it seems like their marriage was probably quite political at first. So for Henry, it was about strengthening his claim, and for Elizabeth, you know, she'd seen her father, her uncle and her brothers be killed in this sort of ongoing feud. So for her, it's probably a chance to bring that to an end, and also to maintain her royal lifestyle, because otherwise she'd have had to have been stepping out of that completely. Although it seems that over time they actually developed quite a good relationship. So they tried to have, lots of children to help create this new dynasty, get it established. Henry VII seems to have been quite a prudent, strong king, although he could be a little bit miserable and miserly, particularly as time went on and after his wife had died. So after Henry VII, you have Henry VIII. It's interesting to note that Henry VIII also wasn't born to be king. His older brother Arthur should have been king. However, unfortunately, Arthur died when he was a teenager, which meant that then Henry was the heir. So Henry's quite a divisive character. He certainly could be very tyrannical and sort of excessive to an extreme in his lifestyle. But he also tried to live by sort of the real sort of morals of the day of the Renaissance. So sort of interested in art and literature and valour. He was very athletic and sporty. So I think in some ways he was probably a good leader, because he was somebody that people could look up to. He was impressive. But particularly as time went on, he certainly did become, maybe he lost that sort of naive optimism that he'd had in these ways, became more pessimistic and certainly more tyrannical. Henry VIII is obviously famous for having 6 wives, who I spoke about a little bit before. But just briefly, his first wife was Catherine of Aragon, who had actually been married to his older brother. So she'd been widowed from his older brother after just a few months. And so she was a little bit older than Henry as well. However, Henry appears to have been like proper into her, and they seem to have actually had a really good marriage. They both were attracted to each other. They got on very well, and they were married for ages. They were married for like 20 years. The only real problem with their marriage was that they didn't have male heirs at the end of it. And it's a real sad story to learn about Catherine, because she had so many pregnancies. She had a lot of stillbirths or babies who died very young, which is obviously really sad and upsetting. And they both did find that, you know, upsetting. All of this time, Henry was having sort of mistresses, and he did appear to have fallen madly in love with Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn seems to have recognised that power and really wielded it to get as much as she could from it. And it's interesting to note with Anne Boleyn as well that her sister had actually been a mistress of Henry VIII and had had a baby by him. So Anne had seen how this infatuation that Henry would have with women would really sort of be excessive. He'd be lavishing them with gifts and attention, but he could quite quickly go off the boil and lose interest and be interested in somebody else. So by holding him back and not allowing him to fulfill his carnal lusts, Anne really got him to go further than he had with any of his other mistresses, to the point where he was desperate to marry her and to have her. And so this eventually led to the breaking with Rome. Although I don't think it was just about the divorce. I think it's worth noting that the Catholic Church did have a lot of corruption in it. And this was the time of sort of Martin Luther and the beginning of the Protestant movement. And I think there were a lot of people who were interested in that and finding perhaps a more authentic religion to practice. But there also was the fact that they just didn't like having the Pope having so much power over them, particularly if the Pope wasn't interested in doing what they wanted and perhaps had stronger alliances with other royal families in Europe. So anyway, all these things combined, and Henry VIII did end up breaking from Rome and beginning the Church of England, which was a massive step. Although it's really interesting to note in Borman's book how much she talks about the actual religious practices really didn't change very much when that break was made. They would still have sort of mass and confession and follow a lot of the same rituals and dates and things like that. So anyway, that change was made. Henry did marry Anne Boleyn, and it's very interesting to see how he did go off her very quickly. So after, I mean, they spent years trying to get this divorce and get married, and then she got pregnant very quickly. She had a daughter, and Henry seems to have gone off her, very quickly. And it appears that forthrightness and strong character that he found so attractive in her is perhaps what actually began to repel him once they were actually married. So anyway, she was got rid of. She was beheaded on charges of treason through adultery. And then Henry married Jane Seymour, who he was already interested in at the time. She had his long-awaited son. However, unfortunately, she died very soon afterwards. After that, Henry married Anne of Cleves, which was really a political marriage, and he wasn't particularly interested in her, and he divorced her quite quickly. Then, you know, he fell madly in love with Catherine Howard. He married her. She was beheaded on charges of treason from adultery, which were probably true. And then his last wife was Catherine Parr, who was twice widowed already. And she was probably quite a good stabilising force for him in just in his last few years. So it's really interesting. He's so famous for these 6 wives, but that was really sort of the last chapter of his being king, because he was married to Catherine for so long. And these last 5 wives all happened in about the space of 10 years or so. Then you had, so when Henry died, his son Edward was 9 and he became king. He was only king for about 6 years, and then he died from a disease. And it seems like there was quite a lot of power play around him over people who wanted to use him for power. Well, I don't think he was just a complete pawn himself, but he was in a very difficult situation. He was probably waiting until he was a bit older and could get more control. After that, Mary became queen. This was Catherine of Aragon's daughter with Henry. And by now she was, I think she was like late 30s. She married Philip, Prince Philip of Spain. Mary was Catholic, Philip was Catholic. The country was now Protestant, particularly under Edward. People had moved that forward even more, and Edward himself was very interested in the idea of pushing Protestantism forward. And then Mary really wanted to go back on that and try to re-establish Catholicism in the country. This was a really tumultuous time in the religion of Britain, and it was a real bloody affair. Mary really tried to force these changes on people, and obviously some people would be supportive of it, but a lot of people suffered from it as well. Mary had a really quite a tragic rule, really. So I think she was only queen for about 5 years, and she spent most of that time desperately trying to get pregnant and having false pregnancies, and it's quite sad, really. And then Elizabeth became queen. Elizabeth is Henry's daughter from Anne Boleyn. So this is the last Tudor monarch. And Elizabeth was queen for a long time. She was a very strong monarch. She did not get married. I think at first she sort of refused to get married. She'd seen, obviously at this time in history, men really do have a lot of power compared to women. And so by not marrying, she maintained that power of the sovereign. And I think although she considered marriage at different times, ultimately she stayed single, and she was a very strong monarch, and very, very interested in, the country and doing it properly. So that's roughly who they are. But this book, it doesn't just concentrate on roughly who they are. It's really going into details about their private lives, and it was so interesting. So things like the clothes that they wore, the elaborate gowns. I mean, the amount of jewels that they had on clothes and things is just insane. And little details about, say, for Elizabeth, that she would have to be literally sewn into her clothes each day, which is just incredible. It's amazing detail. Things like the food, understanding of like the food that they would have eaten, and how much food the royal family was expected to put on for the whole court, and it was a real, it was a whole industry. The history of the buildings that they lived in, because they didn't just live in one palace, they travelled around a lot. And it's interesting to hear, some of the reasons why they would travel around a lot, because when they're going to a new area, they're killing a lot of animals, they're using a lot of the food and resources, they're creating a lot of waste, and then they would move on to, another palace a few months later and have a sort of movement around. And finding out the history of some of these buildings, it's also really interesting. Hearing about the illnesses that they suffered with. They certainly did seem to have their sort of fair share of illnesses, particularly so Henry VIII, who was probably a bit of a hypochondriac, but he also had his leg injury that he'd got when jousting, which was a continuous problem for him in the later part of his life. And also Mary with her phantom pregnancies. It seemed like a lot of the women had some problems with pregnancies and things. Borman also gives details about like the maternity procedures, the medical procedures of the time, which are really fascinating and interesting. I always think it's interesting how medically things, like literally within 100 years or so of them being the thing that the doctors knew was the best thing to do, it's like, that was mad. Should never have done that. And you see that again and again through history. And obviously in this time, because some of the medical procedures were pretty barbaric. Some of them were just strange. It's also interesting hearing about the way that the court was set up, in terms of this, the rooms where people would go hoping to see the royals, the private rooms, and how these rooms' uses got changed over time. How some monarchs would use the privy chambers more, and some would use not more public rooms or more personal rooms. So that was really interesting. And yeah, just all their relationships, all their personal servants and the people around. It's really, really, really interesting. And I think Borman gave a really thorough, and she just seemed to create a really amazing environment. So, you know, you could feel like you were there, and it wasn't at any time boring or uninteresting. There was so much real little details that you could really sort of create this picture. It's wonderful. There wasn't much talk about sort of the normal people, if you like, but there was mentions about sort of there was a lot of illnesses and plagues and things going through the country. So, you know, it's interesting to see this absolute opulence of the lifestyles of the Tudor monarchs, and trying to contrast that with the day-to-day life of the vast majority of people of the country, which would have been, you know, incredibly different. And actually, I think there would be a lot of poverty around at that time. To have so much disease, there must have been a lot of poverty. But the, you know, the excesses of the royal family is interesting to learn about. Particularly with people like Elizabeth as well, and Henry, I suppose. You learn about their sort of the loyalty of some of their servants and people who they had around them all their lives. And yeah, it's really interesting because they would really form this sort of close-knit thing. And I think that's what you want as a monarch. You want people who you've known for such a long time, who you feel that you can trust, that you can be yourself with. Yeah, really interesting. I've got one little quote that I was going to read out just to give sort of a bit of an example of the style of the writing. So this is from when Elizabeth is the Queen, and it's just after the Spanish Armada attempt. So this was a planned invasion by Spain. So Elizabeth had a lot of problems during her rule because the Catholic countries in Europe, you know, there was like a papal bull against her because she was excommunicated. So other people would feel that they've got the right to attack England, you know, if they wanted an excuse to. And even in Scotland, with Mary, Queen of Scots, who was Catholic and had been in the French court and things. So she had, you know, it was a real sort of balancing act to push those people off and try and maintain relationships with them as well, and whilst not giving in, whilst continuing on this Protestant track. So anyway, in the event the Armada failed to join forces with Parma, the tactics of the English Navy proved superior, and the weather also played a part in vanquishing the attempted Spanish invasion. This was Elizabeth's finest hour. At a stroke she became the celebrated Gloriana of legend, immortalised in portraits and prose, all praising her wisdom, virtue and beauty. Now, at last, her virginity was something to be celebrated. It enhanced her divine status as the Virgin Mary on earth. Her sex, too, was no longer a source of regret, and Elizabeth had the confidence to flaunt her femininity, both in her dress and her speeches. Okay, so talking about how it was really difficult for her in the beginning to stay as a single woman and not get married and not fall into that expected behaviour. But in the end, it ended up being a real strength for her, and she was an incredibly strong monarch. Okay, so that's the end of that book. I love that book, and I would definitely recommend it. And it would be a really good introduction just to learn about the Tudors, about who they are, and being able to cover the whole dynasty in one book. And I felt she did that really, really well. It didn't feel like she was having to sort of miss lots out and things. She seemed to cover things really, really well. So I'd really love to read more books by Tracy Borman as well. Okay, so the other book that I'm reading right now is this one. It is a Seth book, The Individual and the Nature of Mass Events. So if you know me at all, you'll know that I absolutely love the Seth books. So I am enjoying this tons, and I can't wait to be able to do a review for it. Okay, thank you.